What if your ability to feel someone else's pain wasn't just kindness, but survival? We tend to think of empathy as a choice, a noble one, perhaps, a luxury of civilized minds. But what if it's something far deeper, something ancient, wired into bone and synapse, beating beneath instinct and biology? Because across species and centuries, from rats in silent laboratories to mothers shielding their children in war zones, empathy has quietly, persistently kept life alive. But that raises a disturbing paradox. Evolution is not gentle. It's not here to make you good. It's here to make you last. The law of the wild is not kindness. It is survival. Sharper teeth, faster reflexes, better genes. Nature doesn't select what's soft. It selects what works. So why would nature, in all its ruthless elegance, favor something as fragile, as self-sacrificial, as empathy? This contradiction sits at the heart of a mystery we rarely question, because we assume empathy is moral, human, and logical. But it isn't. Empathy defies logic. Soldiers run into burning buildings to save strangers. A lioness, apex predator of the savannah, will sometimes adopt a newborn gazelle, not to eat it, but to lick it clean and protect it, as if it were her own cub. And we humans, we weep at movies, our hearts breaking for stories that never happened, for people who never lived. These aren't just oddities, they're biological costs, time, energy, even life spent on others. In the math of evolution, these choices don't make sense, and yet they happen. Not just sometimes, but reliably, across cultures, and across species. So where does this come from? To find out, we go back to a dimly lit lab in the year 1959. American psychologist Russell Church wasn't trying to study love or compassion. He was studying behavior, cold, controlled, quantifiable. His experiment was simple. A rat was placed in a chamber. If it pressed a lever, it received food, a fair trade. But then the equation changed. Now, every time the rat pressed the lever, a second rat, visible in a nearby enclosure, would receive a mild electric shock. Logically, the rat should have kept eating. It wasn't being harmed. It wasn't trained to care. And yet, something astonishing happened. The rat stopped pressing the lever. It chose to go hungry to suffer, so the other rat wouldn't. This wasn't a one-time fluke. Repeated experiments confirmed the pattern. When given the choice between a reward for themselves or relief for another, many rats chose relief, even at personal cost. In later versions, one rat was trapped in a small box while the other remained free. No shocks, no food, just the option: do nothing or free your trapped companion. Again and again, rats chose to help, not for treats, not for training, simply because another rat was in distress. This is not a Disney story, it's a biological one, and it raised a question that would echo through decades of neuroscience, ethology, and evolutionary theory. Why? Why would a creature, any creature, evolve the capacity to feel the pain of another? Because that's what empathy is. It's not sympathy, or moral goodness, or abstract thought. Empathy is visceral. It's physical. When you see someone get hurt and you wince, that's empathy. When your heart races watching a loved one panic, or when tears swell in your eyes at the sound of someone else crying, that's empathy. Your brain is literally mirroring what another brain is experiencing, and this mirroring happens fast. It bypasses conscious thought. It arises in areas of the brain associated with emotion, motion, and pain: the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the somatosensory cortex. It lights up when you are in pain, and it lights up just the same when someone else is. That's not morality. That's biology. But what kind of biology is that? Empathy, by definition, makes you vulnerable. It slows you down. It pulls you into another's suffering, and yet it survives. Not just in humans, but in elephants who mourn their dead, in bonobos who comfort the distressed, in dolphins who support injured companions by swimming beneath them to help them breathe. Empathy may look irrational, but it keeps appearing, across species, across environments, across evolutionary branches that diverged millions of years ago. This suggests something profound. Empathy might not be a bug in the system. It might be a feature. Maybe empathy isn't weakness. Maybe it's one of the most powerful and mysterious adaptations in the natural world. What if the very act of feeling someone else's pain is not a liability, but an evolutionary strategy? Not for individuals, but for groups. For survival. Not just of the fittest, but the most connected. Empathy may have emerged, not in spite of evolution, but because of it. Empathy, often thought of as a soft emotion, or a moral luxury, is in fact a deep biological instinct, rooted in our evolutionary history, one that predates humanity itself. Long before humans could speak, long before civilizations emerged, the foundations of empathy were already forming in the brains of birds, mammals, and even some insects. When a flock of birds lifts into the sky at once because one sensed a threat, or when a mouse freezes at the distress call of another, we witnessed a primitive version of what we would later call feeling with. This synchronized behavior, observed across species, reflects an ancient neural reflex, a shared nervous system, alertness that evolved not simply to protect the individual, but to preserve the group. In evolutionary terms, empathy began not as kindness, but as survival. To understand another's fear was to be warned. To mimic another's action was to adapt quickly. Long before language, there was resonance. Among mammals, particularly primates, this resonance became more sophisticated. Mirror neurons, specialized cells discovered in the brains of monkeys, fire not only when an animal performs an action, but also when it observes the same action in another. Watching someone grasp a branch or flinch in pain triggers a mirrored neural response, as if the observer is performing or feeling the action themselves. These neurons form the basis of perception action, coupling the idea that understanding others is not merely cognitive but embodied. Our brains, quite literally, simulate others' experiences within ourselves. This isn't sentimentality. It's biology. It's the wiring that lets us learn by watching and survive by attuning to others. Charles Darwin, often invoked for his theory of survival of the fittest, also wrote powerfully about the survival of the most cooperative in his later work, particularly in The Descent of Man. Darwin argued that sympathy, what we now call empathy, was a crucial moral instinct, selected for because it bonded early human communities. In Darwin's words, those communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best. This moral instinct, rooted in our biology, helped our ancestors form alliances, care for the sick, and nurture their young long before formal ethics, religion, or law. Empathy was not an afterthought to evolution. It was one of its guiding strategies. Fast forward to today's neuroscience, and the picture grows even more intricate. Empathy is no longer seen as a singular emotion, but as a neural network distributed across multiple systems of the brain. The anterior insula lights up when we witness someone else in pain, allowing us to feel their discomfort. The anterior cingulate cortex helps us process that emotion cognitively. Oxytocin, often dubbed the bonding hormone, enhances social trust, an emotional closeness, playing a key role in maternal care, friendship, and even group identity. These systems work in tandem, forming what some researchers call the empathy circuit. But critically, this circuit is not always active. It can be dampened by fear, stress, prejudice, or overload. Empathy is a biological capacity, but also a contextual state. It can be shaped, and it can be lost. In practical terms, empathy is not a luxury, it's a daily force shaping how humans live, work, and relate. It governs who we trust, who we help, and who we exclude. In parenting, empathetic attunement helps infants regulate stress and develop secure attachment. In politics, the ability to imagine others' perspectives informs policies on healthcare, education, and justice. In conflict resolution, empathy can be the bridge between violence and reconciliation. Yet, the flip side is equally true. When empathy fails, when we stop recognizing others as like us, violence becomes easier, indifference spreads, and systems of inequality persist. Lack of empathy is often interpreted as cruelty, but it can stem from neurological differences. Individuals on the autism spectrum, for instance, may experience empathy differently, with challenges in cognitive empathy understanding what others think, but intact or even heightened emotional empathy, feeling what others feel. Psychopathy, on the other hand, often involves a near-complete absence of emotional empathy, yet sometimes intact cognitive empathy, which can be used manipulatively. Trauma, too, can numb empathetic circuits. A person repeatedly exposed to violence or neglect may shut down emotionally as a defense mechanism, creating a barrier to feeling with others. Thus, empathy is not simply a virtue, it's a neurological condition shaped by biology, environment, and experience. In our current age, the stakes of empathy have never been higher. We are more connected than ever through social media, global networks, and shared crises, yet paradoxically more divided. The algorithms that drive our digital lives often reward outrage over understanding, tribalism over nuance. In such an environment, empathy becomes fragmented, extended only to those who look like us, vote like us, suffer like us. This tribal empathy creates echo chambers where compassion stops at the border of identity. And as polarization rises, so does the dehumanization of the other. It becomes easier to mock, to dismiss, even to hate, not because we've become more evil, but because our brains are less frequently called to simulate the inner worlds of those outside our immediate tribe. The question, then, is not whether empathy exists, but whether we are using it wisely, protecting it, and cultivating it. In classrooms, how do we teach children to imagine the lives of those different from them? In media, how do we tell stories that humanize rather than demonize? In justice systems, how do we factor in the emotional development of those who cause harm? And in our daily lives, what small practices keep our empathy circuits alive? A glance, a touch, a pause to ask what someone else is feeling. Because when we stop recognizing others as like us, we risk unraveling the very social fabric that made our species flourish. Empathy is not just a soft skill, it is the invisible infrastructure of civilization. It's what keeps neighbors from turning into enemies and societies from collapsing into chaos. It's the thread that connects personal kindness to collective survival. And in a world facing climate upheaval, technological disruption, and cultural fragmentation, empathy may be one of the most vital tools we have left. In the end, empathy is not just about understanding others, it's about understanding what it means to be human. To know that another's pain echoes in your own nervous system. To feel that your fate is entangled with theirs. And to act, not out of obligation, but out of resonance. A quiet knowledge that we are all, in some deep, biological sense, mirrors of each other. In 2007, a quiet but profound revolution unfolded in a neuroscience lab at the University of Parma. Researchers studying macaque monkeys identified something astonishing, a specific class of neurons that fired not only when the monkey performed an action such as reaching for a peanut, but also when it observed another monkey or a human doing the same thing. These were not just passive observation cells. They were mirror neurons, cells that blurred the line between self and other. To the brain, watching someone grasp an object was functionally identical to grasping it yourself. It was as if the brain was saying, "I see you, and in some way I am you." This discovery was more than a curiosity. It suggested something radical, that the human mind, long thought to be an isolated fortress of consciousness, is in fact wired for resonance, built to simulate the intentions, feelings, and actions of others. Empathy, in this light, is not merely a learned virtue. It's a built-in capacity, a biological echo. The implications were enormous. If our brains come equipped with mechanisms for understanding others through internal simulation, then empathy is not a moral achievement, it is a default mode of social cognition. We are, at our core, relational beings. Our minds are not just for thinking about the world, but for synchronizing with it, especially with other people. This theory, later supported by neuroimaging studies in humans, showed that similar neural circuits activate when people experience pain themselves or witness pain in someone else. Emotion became not just something we feel, but something we share neurologically, viscerally. Empathy was not a weakness to be overcome, but a cornerstone of human intelligence. And yet, as soon as this empathetic machinery was mapped, an uncomfortable truth surfaced. Empathy, for all its beauty, has a dark and deeply consequential bias. We do not empathize equally. Studies found that people's brains lit up more when someone from their own group, racially, politically, culturally, was in pain, compared to someone from an outgroup. This selective empathy, known as parochial empathy, is biologically real and socially destructive. In other words, the same mirror neurons that allow us to feel someone else's suffering are calibrated, often unconsciously, by tribal instincts. We care more about us than them, even when the suffering is the same. This bias is not limited to extreme cases. It shows up in courtroom decisions, school discipline, disaster relief, and even medical treatment. It's why a news story about one child's tragedy in our country can move us more than 1,000 deaths abroad. Our compassion, it turns out, has borders. This moral dilemma cuts to the heart of the human condition. If empathy is hardwired, why does it divide us as much as it unites us? How can something so seemingly noble reinforce racism, nationalism, and injustice? Some researchers argue that empathy evolved not to create universal compassion, but to strengthen bonds within groups. In ancestral times, this made sense. Helping your tribe ensured survival. But in the modern world, globalized, diverse, interconnected, this same instinct can fuel division. Parochial empathy isn't just a glitch. It's a feature that no longer serves us, So the question emerges, is empathy our salvation or our blind spot? To answer that, we must understand where empathy comes from. Is it in our DNA, or does it arise through experience, learning, and culture? Twin studies offer a clue. Identical twins, even when raised apart, often show similar levels of empathetic response, suggesting a genetic component. But the story doesn't end there. Empathy is also shaped profoundly by early attachment, trauma, parental modeling, and even language. Children raised in nurturing environments, where emotions are named and validated, show more sophisticated empathic responses. Conversely, children exposed to neglect, violence, or emotional suppression may struggle to tune into others or may develop hyperempathy as a survival skill. Culture adds another layer. In collectivist societies, empathy is often extended more broadly and expected more overtly. While in individualist cultures, emotional attunement may be privatized or even stigmatized. In this way, empathy is neither fixed nor fated. It is plastic. The circuits that govern it, the insula, the cingulate cortex, the mirror neuron system, remain malleable into adulthood. Neuroscience shows that mindfulness training, compassion, meditation, and even reading literary fiction can strengthen empathetic capacity. Conversely, environments of chronic stress, fear-based politics, and digital fragmentation can weaken it. In one experiment, participants who read about suffering while imagining themselves in the same situation activated more empathetic brain regions than those who read passively. Empathy grows when we practice imagining others, but atrophies when we stop. Still, a deeper conflict remains. If empathy is so natural, why do we so often fail to act on it? We feel others' pain, we recognize suffering, and yet we scroll past it. We witness injustice, yet rationalize our inaction. This empathy-action gap is one of the great paradoxes of our age. Part of the reason is emotional fatigue. In a hyper-connected world, we are exposed to constant suffering, war, famine, loss, and our neural circuits can only take so much. Psychologists call this compassion fatigue, when empathy becomes too painful and we unconsciously shut it off. Another factor is diffusion of responsibility. When a need is too large, we assume someone else will step in. And finally, there's moral disengagement. The stories we tell ourselves to justify indifference. They brought it on themselves. It's not my problem. The system is broken anyway. What these mechanisms reveal is a painful truth. Empathy alone is not enough. Feeling with someone doesn't guarantee helping them. In fact, without reflection, empathy can entrench bias, leading us to protect those we identify with and ignore those we don't. It can become a tool of tribal loyalty rather than universal care. And so, we face a dilemma. Can empathy be expanded beyond its evolutionary roots? Can we train ourselves individually and collectively to feel with all others, not just those who mirror us? This is not just a philosophical question, it's a social imperative. From refugee crises to racial injustice, from political polarization to economic inequality, our capacity for universal empathy will shape the fate of our species. If we cannot learn to see the stranger as familiar, the outsider as human, we will be trapped in cycles of division. But if we can, if empathy can be stretched across identity lines, across oceans, across histories, it may offer not just understanding, but transformation. The story of empathy, then, is not a tale of triumph or failure. It is a story in motion, evolving in the space between biology and choice. And at its center is a question as old as humanity itself. When we look into the eyes of another, what do we truly see? A reflection of ourselves, or a boundary that separates us? The deeper we explore empathy, the more we realize it is not a single, simple virtue, but a deeply layered human instinct, rife with contradictions. While empathy is often held up as a moral ideal, history tells a more disturbing story. In the annals of 20th century horror, few chapters are as chilling as the role of Nazi doctors, highly educated, scientifically trained individuals who could demonstrate deep compassion and tenderness toward their own children or Aryan patients, yet perform grotesque experiments on Jewish prisoners without hesitation. This wasn't the absence of empathy, it was the partitioning of empathy. A stark illustration of what happens when empathy is limited to the in-group and denied to all others. It shows that empathy can coexist with cruelty as long as that cruelty is directed outward. And this selective empathy, this moral exclusion, is not confined to history books. It is reappearing in more subtle and systemic forms in the modern world. In the sleek conference rooms of Silicon Valley, another layer of this contradiction unfolds. The very technologies designed to connect us have been fine-tuned, often unintentionally, to exploit our emotional biases. Social media platforms, optimized for engagement, discover quickly that outrage spreads faster than compassion, and that conflict fuels clicks. Algorithms learn to amplify division, not because engineers are malevolent, but because the systems reward attention, and attention is magnetized by emotion, especially anger. What was meant to be a digital commons becomes an empathy minefield. We are encouraged to react, not reflect, to perform morality for our in-groups, not understand others across them. And over time, our capacity for nuance, for quiet listening, for slow understanding, all essential ingredients of real empathy, begins to erode. This tension between empathy and function plays out with devastating clarity in war. Soldiers are often trained explicitly to suppress empathy in order to do their jobs, to see the enemy not as a fellow human being, but as a target, a threat, a symbol. And yet, when the war ends and the adrenaline fades, what often remains is not triumph, but trauma. PTSD is not always caused by what a soldier did, but by what they felt too late. The suppressed empathy surges back, and with it, unbearable moral weight. Some veterans describe a haunting reversal, a sudden realization that the person they killed had a name, a family, a story, and that their pain was once your silence. This conflict between necessary emotional numbing and the eventual reckoning with humanity reveals the immense cost of empathy's absence, and yet the opposite extreme carries its own dangers. In fields where empathy is required daily, emergency medicine, psychotherapy, social work, activism, emotional overload can lead to collapse. Paramedics who respond to dozens of traumatic calls, therapists who absorb endless stories of grief, aid workers who witnessed humanitarian crises up close, all face a growing phenomenon known as empathy fatigue. This is not simply exhaustion, but a neurological shutdown, the mind protecting itself by turning off the very circuits meant to connect. The paradox is brutal. Those who care most are often the ones who burn out first. Too much empathy, unprocessed and unsupported, does not create stronger communities. It destroys the connective tissue it was meant to strengthen. And in the silence that follows, people can become numb, cynical, or even hostile to emotional appeals, So we arrive at a strange truth. Too little empathy divides us, but too much, unbounded, unmanaged, can destroy us. How then do we find the balance? This tension has led some thinkers to challenge empathy itself. Psychologist and philosopher Paul Bloom has been a provocative voice in this debate, arguing that empathy, especially the kind that fixates on individual suffering, leads to moral distortion. Empathy, he says, is biased, myopic, and easily manipulated. It causes us to overreact to vivid tragedies while ignoring statistical suffering. It prioritizes familiar faces over nameless masses. Instead of empathy, Bloom advocates for compassion, a more distanced, deliberate form of care. Compassion, unlike empathy, is not about feeling with, but choosing to help. It is grounded in reason and guided by principle. Compassion does not ask us to emotionally simulate every pain, but to act ethically regardless of our feelings. It is, in a way, a more scalable virtue. This debate, empathy versus compassion, is not just academic. It has real-world consequences in medicine, law, education, and governance. Should a judge show empathy for a defendant's background or apply impartial justice? Should a doctor let empathy guide treatment or rely strictly on protocols? Should governments respond to public empathy spikes, often triggered by viral images, or stick to long-term policy goals? The danger of relying too heavily on emotional empathy is that it can be reactive, inconsistent, and prone to bias. But the danger of abandoning it entirely is a colder, more bureaucratic world, one that forgets that behind every policy, every number, every law is a human life. Nowhere is this conflict more visible than on social media, where empathy seems to both explode and collapse simultaneously. A single image, a drowned refugee child, a crying protester, a police brutality video can spark global outrage and action. But the flood of tragedy is constant, and with scale comes numbness. Psychologists call this the collapse of compassion. Our ability to empathize declines as the number of victims increases. We can feel deeply for one, but feel nothing for millions. The more people suffer, the less we seem to care. Technology, by exposing us to suffering at scale, rewires how we process emotion. What once would have been a singular, galvanizing story becomes a blur in an endless feed. In such a climate, empathy risks becoming performative, something we signal for social capital, rather than something we embody in sustained action. Moreover, the architecture of digital life shapes who we empathize with. Algorithms feed us content that aligns with our preferences, reinforcing identity bubbles. We see the faces of people like us, hear the voices that mirror our own, and engage with stories that confirm our beliefs. This echo chamber doesn't just shape thought, it shapes feeling. Empathy becomes tribalized. We're more likely to empathize with a victim if they share our language, our politics, our aesthetics. Those outside the bubble are flattened into caricatures. Their suffering becomes abstract, suspicious, or invisible. And in this selective empathy, the very thing meant to unite us, the ability to feel with another, becomes a tool of division. In this era of digital saturation, global crisis, and emotional overload, we are faced with a crucial question. What kind of empathy do we need? The raw, emotional kind that connects us in moments of shared pain, or the more detached, principled kind that can endure beyond those moments? Is empathy a reflex to be indulged, or a capacity to be trained and disciplined? Can we teach ourselves to widen the circle of empathy beyond race, beyond class, beyond borders, without burning out or breaking down? The answer may lie in a reconceptualization of empathy not as a singular emotion, but as a spectrum of responses, affective, cognitive, and compassionate, each with strengths and limits. Empathy is not always good, and it is not always fair, but it is foundational. It is the gateway to understanding, the beginning of ethics, the first spark of moral imagination. To wield it wisely, we must understand its faults, its bias, its selectivity, its fragility. And to preserve it, we must design systems in education, media, technology that support empathy without exploiting it. Because if we do not grapple with these tensions, empathy will either burn out or be weaponized. And in both cases, what is lost is not just an emotion, but our capacity to recognize each other as human. Here is the twist, the quiet revolution in how we think about empathy, the realization that disrupts the cozy narratives we've built around it. Empathy is not nice. It was never designed to be kind or moral. It is not some gentle force bestowed upon us to uplift the species. Rather, empathy is strategic. It is a sharpened tool honed by millions of years of evolution, not to serve justice or fairness, but to increase the chances of survival and reproduction. Our ancestors did not evolve empathy because it made them good. They evolved it because it made them smart. In the ruthless game of natural selection, those who could anticipate another's moves, who could gauge intentions, detect emotions, and influence behavior, those individuals had an edge. Empathy, in this light, is less a virtue and more an ancient form of social technology, and, like any technology, it is only as noble or as dangerous as the motives that guide it. Evolution didn't care about goodness, it cared about outcomes, and empathy delivered. Tribes that could cooperate through shared emotional signals, mutual understanding, and coordinated care outlasted those that couldn't. A mother who felt her baby's distress was more likely to respond, and her genes were more likely to pass on. A hunter who could intuit when a fellow hunter was anxious or brave could better coordinate on the hunt. A leader who sensed discontent in the group before it erupted into rebellion could maintain cohesion. In each case, empathy functioned as a kind of biological radar, scanning the emotional environment and adjusting behavior accordingly. This was not universal benevolence. It was contextual cooperation. Empathy served the group, but only insofar as that group served the individual's reproductive and survival interests. What we're left with, then, is a powerful but morally neutral force. And therein lies the big twist. Empathy evolved not as an ethical good, but as a social advantage. It is not built into us as a moral compass. It is built into us as a navigation system, a way to move through the complex terrain of human relationships, alliances, hierarchies, and threats. In its purest biological form, empathy is less about love and more about leverage. It lets us understand the minds of others, not necessarily to help them, but sometimes to control them. This is the hidden agenda of empathy. The capacity that allows us to soothe also allows us to manipulate. The same neural circuits that let a parent comfort a crying child also let a con artist read a victim's weakness. Empathy is a prerequisite for compassion, but it is also a prerequisite for emotional blackmail, for propaganda, for sophisticated deceit. A skilled interrogator must understand pain without feeling it. A charismatic demagogue must know the hopes and fears of the crowd to bend them toward his cause. In fiction, we celebrate the empathetic hero, but in real life, The most chilling manipulators often possess empathy in abundance. Not the warm, tearful kind, but the cold, cognitive kind. The kind that reads emotions like data. The kind that doesn't feel for others, but uses their feelings. This insight forces a reckoning. For too long, we have mistaken empathy for virtue. We've assumed that to feel with another is inherently good, but that's a category error. Empathy is not a moral stance. It's a neurological skill set like language or memory. It can be used for care or for cruelty. It is the how of connection, not the why. The motive, love, or domination comes from elsewhere. Understanding this reframes so much of what we think we know. It explains why people can be fiercely empathetic within their communities and completely indifferent or even hostile to outsiders. It reveals why marketing campaigns can so easily hijack our empathy to sell products, ideologies, or wars. It shows why social media influencers master the art of appearing vulnerable, not to build relationships, but to build brands. In each case, empathy is not virtue, it is strategy. And strategies can be turned toward any goal. But this realization is not cynical, it's clarifying. It helps us take off the rose-colored glasses and see empathy for what it truly is, a form of emotional intelligence that can guide moral behavior, but does not guarantee it. This awareness gives us power. It lets us ask not just how much empathy we have, but what we do with it. Do we expand it beyond our tribe? Do we pair it with reflection, accountability, and compassion? Or do we let it remain unconscious, pulled by bias, used by others, unexamined in ourselves? Empathy is not the endpoint of ethics. It's the beginning of awareness, a tool we must wield with care. It is not inherently good or bad. It is powerful. And in a world where power is increasingly emotional, where influence comes not through violence, but through attention, persuasion, and psychological resonance, the question is no longer, do you feel with others? The question is, what are you doing with that feeling? The evolutionary twist, then, is not that empathy makes us moral. It's that empathy made us viable. It helped us form alliances, share burdens, raise children cooperatively. It allowed early humans to build trust, synchronize, and survive together. But survival, as always, came with trade-offs. The same circuits that lifted us out of isolation can also bind us to prejudice. The same tool that built communities can fracture societies. And now, as we enter an age where empathy is both amplified by technology and strained by overload, we must confront its true nature, not a virtue, but a double-edged capacity. Empathy is not the hero of the human story. It's the method and the meaning of that story. Whether it bends toward justice, peace, or manipulation depends not on how deeply we feel, but on how wisely we use what we feel. Today, after decades of research in neuroscience, psychology, and social science, our understanding of empathy is richer, more nuanced, and more grounded in scientific clarity. We now know that empathy is not a static trait, nor a purely inherited gift, but a dynamic capacity shaped by both biology and experience. It is simultaneously nature and nurture, an innate neurological system that must be cultivated through emotional practice. Just like muscles or language, the brain's empathy circuits strengthen through use. When we consistently engage in experiences that demand emotional presence, attentive, listening, caring for others, imagining different lives, the neural networks responsible for empathy become more active and efficient. Conversely, Chronic stress, social fragmentation, or emotional neglect can weaken these same pathways. In this light, empathy is not an abstract ideal. It is a living system, one that requires deliberate care. This care can take many forms, and one of the most promising discoveries in recent neuroscience is that compassion training, especially practices like loving-kindness meditation, can measurably enhance the brain's empathetic responses. Functional MRI studies have shown that individuals who regularly practice compassion-based meditation exhibit increased activity in regions like the anterior insular and medial prefrontal cortex, areas deeply involved in emotional resonance and perspective-taking. Moreover, these changes are not fleeting. They can become embedded traits. Importantly, this form of training does not just make people softer, it makes them more emotionally resilient. Compassion meditation helps people stay connected to others' pain without becoming overwhelmed. This is the key. Empathy alone can burn us out, but compassion, grounded in mindfulness and intentional care, provides stability, a way to engage deeply without collapsing. But in embracing this science, we must also honor the complexity of human minds, especially through the lens of neurodiversity. Not everyone experiences empathy in the same way. For too long, empathy has been misunderstood as a simple binary: you have it or you don't. Now we recognize a broader spectrum. Consider autism. Popular portrayals often suggest that autistic individuals lack empathy, but this is profoundly misleading. Many people on the autism spectrum report feeling too much, experiencing overwhelming emotional contagion without the ability to easily interpret or respond to those feelings. Others may struggle with cognitive empathy, understanding another's perspective, but have deep and genuine emotional empathy, sharing another's feelings. Misjudging this complexity not only marginalizes neurodivergent individuals, it distorts our collective understanding of empathy itself. Real empathy science must make room for diverse minds and emotional architectures. This leads us to a critical insight. Empathy is not one thing. It is not just feeling someone's pain. It includes emotional empathy, affective resonance, cognitive empathy, understanding another's thoughts, and compassionate empathy, the drive to act on behalf of others. These components interact and can develop at different rates or intensities in different people. Therefore, protecting empathy in ourselves and in society requires both awareness and intentional habits. First, we must regulate our exposure. In a media environment engineered to overwhelm with endless tragedy, outrage, and doom-scrolling, it is essential to filter what we consume. Not to become indifferent, but to remain effective. The human brain is not built to emotionally process the suffering of millions at once. To protect empathy, we must make space for recovery, for silence, boundaries, and conscious reflection. This is not selfishness. It is emotional maintenance. Second, we must shift from performative empathy to effective empathy. Feeling someone's pain is not enough, especially if it paralyzes us. The question is not just what do I feel, but what can I do that helps? Effective empathy transforms emotion into action, whether it's listening more deeply, supporting a cause, changing a habit, or showing up for someone in distress. Sometimes effective empathy looks quiet, respecting boundaries, not assuming we know someone's story, or stepping back to let someone else lead. Other times, it looks bold, fighting for justice, challenging systems, or speaking truth when it's uncomfortable. The shift is subtle but crucial, from emotion-centered to impact-centered empathy on a broader scale. Societies are beginning to explore how empathy science can shape systems, not just individual behavior. Education, for example, is a fertile ground. Schools that incorporate social-emotional learning, SEL programs that teach students how to recognize emotions, resolve conflicts, and see from others' perspectives consistently report improvements in academic achievement, peer relationships, and mental health. But empathy education cannot stop at childhood. It must extend into the institutions that govern our lives. Consider criminal justice. Traditional models often focus on punishment and control, but insights from empathy research, especially regarding trauma, attachment, and emotional regulation, are reshaping ideas of rehabilitation and restorative justice. Programs that integrate empathy training for offenders, victims, and communities have shown reduced recidivism and increased healing. These are not sentimental approaches. They are evidence-based strategies grounded in how human beings actually change. Healthcare, too, is evolving. Empathy is being reintegrated into medical training, not just as a bedside manner, but as a diagnostic and therapeutic tool. Studies show that doctors who practice empathetic listening have patients with better outcomes, higher adherence to treatment, and lower rates of malpractice claims. Yet physicians also face empathy fatigue, especially in under-resourced environments. Balancing empathy with boundaries and institutional support is essential. The same goes for social work, counseling, and frontline professions. Systems must be redesigned not only to expect empathy, but to support it. Technology, paradoxically, may offer tools to deepen empathy when used wisely. Storytelling, especially through immersive mediums like virtual reality VR, has been shown to increase empathy for others, especially those from marginalized groups. Walking in someone else's shoes, even virtually, activates emotional circuits in ways that abstract statistics never could. Art, film, literature, all remain potent empathy vehicles, reminding us of our shared humanity across distance and difference. But again, the key is intentionality. The same tools that humanize can also sensationalize, exploit, or overwhelm in this way. The resolution of the empathy story is not a conclusion, but a call to conscious practice. We now understand that empathy is a biological inheritance and a social responsibility. It is shaped by genes, molded by culture, and refined by effort. To protect it, we must build emotional endurance. To expand it, we must teach the next generation to feel wisely and act justly. And to make it last, we must root it in systems that do not exploit our instincts, but elevate them. Empathy is not a finite resource, but it is a fragile one. Left unexamined, it will narrow. Left unsupported, it will fade. But nurtured with awareness, boundaries, and courage, empathy can become more than an emotional reflex. It can become a way of seeing and shaping the world somewhere deep in your brain, beneath language, beneath thought. Something ancient stirs when you see a tear fall. Not just recognition, but replication. Your neurons mirror that emotion, as if the sorrow were your own. It's subtle, almost silent, a tightening in the chest, a soft ache behind the eyes, a slight stillness in your body, a biological echo, one that plays without permission. This reflex, to feel with, is older than civilization. It predates cities, currencies, and laws. Before we built empires, we built attachments. Before we wrote philosophies, we responded to pain with presence. Somewhere along our evolutionary path, Our brains learned not just to protect ourselves, but to resonate with others. Empathy, then, is not an invention of morality. It is a trace of memory, a living fossil embedded in the folds of our nervous system, a memory that whispers, in the language of sensation, "You are not alone." And perhaps that's the most astonishing realization of all. Empathy, which we so often reduce to sentimentality, is in fact a deep and persistent reminder that our lives have never been separate, that what happens to one of us, in some way, happens to all. This resonance is not weakness, it is continuity. A continuity that connects a crying infant to a mother's heartbeat, a grieving friend to a consoling hug, a frightened child to a stranger's calm. Empathy is not merely a social function. It is a biological remembrance, a thread woven into us by the logic of survival, yes, but also by the grace of connection. It is a silent archive of every moment one being reached for another, and was met, not with indifference, but with presence. This reframe matters, because in a world that moves fast and often fractures us into isolated islands, politically, digitally, emotionally, we risk seeing empathy as an outdated luxury, as something soft in a hard world. But what if empathy is not softness, but endurance? What if it's not a sentimental indulgence, but evolution's most durable strategy for belonging? Perhaps the real strength of empathy is not how much it makes us feel, but how much it helps us remember. Remember that we've always been wired to connect, that our brains are not sealed vaults of selfhood, but porous, echoing chambers, built to carry the sound of others' joy and pain alike. And so, we come to the final, fragile question, one that doesn't ask for answers, but for attention. If your brain is wired to feel another's sorrow, if your mirror neurons fire not out of logic, but instinct, if every act of empathy is a signal passed down through time, from creature to creature, heart to heart, then what is empathy, really? Could it be that empathy is not merely a feeling, not merely a reflex, but a message encoded in our biology, passed through blood and breath, from ancestor to descendant, saying, "Your pain is also mine," and that's how we survive.